So I like, how many like that new format for starting? It worked out pretty well? Yeah? Okay. That's good? All right. Any good connections made?
Yes.
Okay, give me an example of a connection that was made. Annie, what happened for you?
Well, I just said I was working on it. I didn't get a chance to speak to everyone I wanted to in just 5 minutes.
Okay.
I just, hearing everyone's story, especially Lawrence, who said he grows companies 20%. Yes. I'm really interested in what makes a business thrive and really how do you turn something over into something so profitable. And so
I have a simple direct response.
Oh, great. Thank you so much.
All right. Anybody else make an interesting connection in that quick dance? Yeah, okay. Heather, what did you get?
Well, I'm just really excited what the Anne is doing, because obviously with Evangelical Homes we have a lot of volunteers, so if I can get one or more of them highlighted in her December edition, that'll be really cool.
Okay. Any other examples? Dave, did you lend any of that money yet?
It's all around the room.
Okay. I want to thank the Old National Bank for being a sponsor, and also Zingerman's for being a sponsor for the event, and Roger Rail with his media company. So we've had a lot of great sponsors over the years, and we're always looking for new sponsors. So if you we got the program launching, new program in 2015, should be great. We've got Larry Freed from 4C, one of the most successful entrepreneurs in town, speaking next month. And in December, we've got Len Middleton, who will be announcing a great new medical device innovation program at the University of Michigan. Len is one of our top professors at the university. So I want to, without further ado, bring up my friend Jim Tobin. And Jim has been, where is Jim? There he is. I've known Jim for, we figured this out, since he was about 20 years old, which I won't say how many years it is, but I know his big brother, and we met when we first moved to Ann Arbor in about 1977, 78. So known each other for a long time. And I've had the great pleasure of seeing Jim go through the University of Michigan as an undergrad, and then getting his PhD at the University of Michigan in history. And he wrote a dissertation on the famous World War II journalist Ernie Pyle. Does anybody know who Ernie Pyle is, or has read Jim's book on Ernie Pyle? So Jim then published a book, and the book won the National Critics Book Award for biographies. What year was that, Jim? 1990 something? 98, yeah. And then Jim has gone on to have an illustrious career. He's now a full professor at Miami University in Oxford. I won't say the name of the state, but it's in Oxford. And he is working on many things, including the bicentennial at the University of Michigan, where he's doing a lot of really important work on the history of the university. And he's kind of an expert on that area. He's a new grandpa, and we kind of share that fun because your grandchild and my grandchild were born about the same time, so we're waiting to get them together to play, and it's been a lot of fun. Jim has also become kind of an expert, I would say, on great leaders, and that's what he's going to be talking about today, particularly on his new book, The Man He Became, right, by Jim, and it's about one of my heroes, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Jim, first book I ever remember in our house was a little tiny paperback on Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It's published in about 1946, right after he died. And my parents, as in many families, were just, that was their absolute idol, was FDR. So I'm really excited about hearing about this. He's also written about the Wright brothers. He's written a book about engineering feats that was part of a public television series. And I'm probably missing a few others, but it's with great pleasure that I introduce my friend Jim Tobin.
Thanks a lot, Rob. Thanks for having me. Thank Hillary Gustafson from Literati for bringing books over too. It's the first time I've heard the word bestseller associated with this book of mine, so that made my morning. I'm a writer, not a speaker, so I hope you'll forgive me if I have to rely on notes as I go through this talk. The book is called The Man He Became, How FDR Defied Polio to Win the Presidency. I had the idea for the book, and I went to my publisher and pitched this story. This is what nonfiction writers do. They don't write the book first. They get a contract first, giving a kind of business plan to the publisher, saying this is this great book I'm going to write and you're going to sell 1 million copies. And then that's over with, and you have the contract in hand, and you think, now what do I do? Now I actually have to write this great story. So I did what all historians do. I went to an archive, in this case the Franklin Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, New York, for the first of many visits, and I asked for boxes of old letters and papers, stuff that other people have thrown away. That's what historians deal with. And I started to turn the pages. This is what, the great historian biographer Robert Caro, this multiple volume biography of Lyndon Johnson that he's writing. He was asked, how did you do this? How did you do this amazing work of multi-volume biography? He said, I just went to that library down in Austin, Texas, and I turned every page in every box. Well, I certainly didn't turn over every page in the FDR library, but I did turn over a pretty substantial fraction of them. And I began to assemble a story. Just to orient you in time, the book covers a period of about 12 years, from the year 1921, when FDR was 38 years old. He had 39 years old. He had just been the nominee of the Democratic Party for vice president the year before, 1920. Lost that race, but became really the sort of rising young comer in the Democratic Party. Everybody looked to him for great things to come. He had this very famous name. His distant cousin, his wife's uncle, Theodore Roosevelt, had just died in 1919, the most famous political name of his generation. So FDR had lots of credentials for a great run as a national politician. People expected him to probably become governor of New York, and that inevitably would lead to a run for the presidency. He contracted polio in 1921, and then mounted this long period of trying to come back into politics, was elected governor of New York finally in 1928, and then re-elected to the governorship in 1930, and then of course ran for president in 1932 in the midst of the Great Depression, and defeated Herbert Hoover. That's the period that the book covers. So as I say, the subtitle is How FDR Defied Polio to Win the Presidency. Well, I was nervous about what I would about whether I would be able to come up with a convincing and persuasive and interesting story to tell. What could I say about FDR and polio that wasn't already well known? That was the thing that was on my mind. There were sort of two narratives about how that happened that America has told itself. The first one, certainly that I grew up with in the 1960s, was a narrative of courage. I can remember Rob spoke about his folks having, sort of worshiping FDR. The FDR worshiper in my family was my grandmother, who had been a teacher of music in the Detroit public schools, great fan of the New Deal, great fan of Roosevelt. And I can remember when I was 5 or 6 years old, her sort of taking me aside and telling me the story of this heroic man who had been crippled with polio, which all of us knew about. We had the sugar cube, and he had early in his career had to walk across the stage on crutches by himself, despite having polio. That was the first thing I was ever told about a great American leader. This heroic act of physical courage, and I think that was generally present in the 50s and 60s. People all understood that story, knew about his polio, knew he had been crippled, knew he had come back. Now, for those of you who are younger, I bet that sounds a little unfamiliar, because the second narrative about FDR that has prevailed in the last 10, 20 years or so has been the narrative that somehow he fooled the public into believing that he had not had polio, that he had not been crippled, that there was a great deception that had been carried off. a great cover-up. I think that that is largely the result of this, recent generation having grown up in the years after Watergate, in the years of Bill Clinton lying about his affair with Monica Lewinsky, George Bush lying about weapons of mass destruction. We tend to have this assumption that presidents lie about the most important details of their lives. Well, as I turned those pages at the FDR Library, I came to think that neither of those narratives really told the whole story, that both of them were far too simple. I like to say that what you can do when you get a PhD is you're able to tell people, well, it's a lot more complicated than that. So how did he do it? His political career was absolutely finished. He was paralyzed from about here, not just the waist down, but from about, the middle of his torso down to his feet. In a period when disabled people simply did not have a future in public life. Everyone assumed that he was out of politics. Including his wife. I think Eleanor Roosevelt, although she encouraged him to stay involved with politics, she had no real thought at the time that he could ever possibly resume a political career. And yet, just a few years later, he was governor of New York, an incredible candidate for the presidency, which he then, of course, won. So how did he do this? As I've tried to boil this down, I think that he did three crucial things that sound like common sense, but it's worth thinking about as important adjustments to great setbacks when you're trying to win back an influential role in life. First of all, he redefined his problem. Let me tell you what I mean. From the beginning, in a kind of state of shock and denial, FDR decided he was going to walk again. Nothing would stop him from walking again unassisted. And so he undertook this long, very difficult, tedious course of physical rehabilitation. In fact, FDR was sort of a pioneer of what we now think of as the field of physical therapy. He worked on exercises for his upper body and his lower body for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And in fact, by about 1925-26, in spite of trying all kinds of different physical therapies, everything that he could find out about, none of them had restored his ability to walk by himself. He wore braces from the waist down to his heels. He could walk with crutches. He could walk with, holding somebody's arm. It was very labored, very difficult. He could barely get across a room, even that way. And so, with the help of some very sophisticated new physical therapists, the best that there were at the time, he redefined his problem and made it not the problem of walking unassisted, but of something quite different. And it was captured in a moment that was recorded by one of his physical therapists down at Warm Springs, Georgia. He said to her, when they began this new round of treatment, help me to come into a room without scaring everyone half to death. Help me make people, what's the quote exactly? Help me stand easily enough that people will forget that I'm a cripple. Now think about what that means. He had learned that the problem, the essential problem, was not in his body. It was in the minds of other people. The problem was the problem of prejudice, of stigma toward the disabled. So let me ask you, if you're able-bodied, have you ever avoided interactions with a disabled person because you didn't know how to talk with them? You were distracted by the disability? You couldn't focus on them as a person? Did you ever feel a sense of pity that you didn't know how to express? a sense of embarrassment, perhaps even a sense of physical revulsion. If I'm honest with myself, I know that I've felt all those things in exchanges with disabled people. And think what that would mean to someone trying to assume a position of leadership. You cannot have people pity you and then lead them. You can't have people distracted. You have to capture people's attention. And this was going to be impossible if FDR could not overcome that sense of stigma. And so he did the thing that he took the second step that I think was so important here. He used his strengths to compensate for his weaknesses. First of all, he did this physically by building up his upper body, which allowed him to maneuver more easily on crutches and enabled him to move from wheelchair to a regular straight chair and back again. This was essential to the mobility that he did accomplish. He used his head, his face, to deflect attention from his lower body. Many people remarked upon this. Artists, when FDR was president, who tried to paint his portrait, said he was a very difficult subject because his expression was constantly changing. He was always using his face to sort of guide the flow of attention. He was a constant talker. He was certainly like this before he became polio, but I think polio exacerbated his loquaciousness. People would be invited into the Oval Office when he was president. You know, they'd be given 5 minutes to speak to FDR. And they would come out 45 minutes later not having gotten a word in edgewise. And what he would say to end a conversation that he had dominated, he would always say, you know, seated behind his desk, unable to rise, unable to stand, unable to walk by himself. He would say, after talking straight for an hour, well, I've got to run along now. So, there's a moment, speaking of using his head, literally his head, to deflect attention. The 1924 Democratic Convention, which was sort of the start of his comeback, he was asked to nominate Governor Al Smith of New York for the presidency, rising figure in politics who would later become FDR's rival in the Democratic Party. So this was FDR's first appearance. People had seen him 4 years before the Democratic National Convention in San Francisco as this vigorous, athletic young man dashing around the convention hall. Now they see him, this frail, weak figure on crutches. This is the scene that my grandmother had told me about, later captured in the movie Sunrise at Campobello. My grandmother was doing Ronald Reagan history when she told me that story, you know, telling me the history that had appeared in a movie rather than the history had actually happened. In this case, it did happen. So FDR had to use crutches to get over to the lectern in front of this giant, you know, crowd at Madison Square Garden. And he could not wave as most politicians would in that situation because he had to grip the lectern to hold himself up. So when he reached the lectern after this labored walk across the stage, he got there and he gripped the lectern and he threw his head up and smiled. And the people who were there said it absolutely brought the place down after this tense period of 30 seconds watching him struggle, and then to throw that head up and smile. There was an electric response in the audience. That's an example of using his body to deflect attention from his weakness toward his strength. These are the things like that, I say deflecting attention, these are some of the things that have caused people in recent years to say that FDR deceived the public about his disability. But I think there's a great difference between deception, covering up the fact that he was disabled, which he certainly did not do, and leading people's attention to other aspects of his personality. Everybody did know that he had polio, and we know this because of this third thing that he did to move from polio to the presidency. He embraced He embraced his disability as part of his new narrative, as part of his new identity. It was central to his political identity by the time he ran for governor in 1928. There's a funny thing about this. People who have been severely disabled, when they are asked frankly about their experience, will sometimes say that fighting their disability had been, yes, a struggle, but also a source of meaning, a source of joy in their lives. There's a wonderful quote. There's an Italian psychologist named Fausto Massimini who did studies of young disabled people in Italy about what role disability had in their lives. One of them said, learning to live again was itself a matter of enjoyment and pride. I think that that's very much the way it was for FDR. He found a kind of new zest in life from the progress that he made in overcoming this severe setback. There was a moment at a dinner party, the Roosevelts were always entertaining, and one time they had guests, Eleanor and Franklin hosting, and FDR, as he often did, kept talking about his recovery when he was speaking with friends. He said, look what I've learned to do. And he sort of shifts his body, he gets out of his chair, he drops to the floor on his belly, and he crawls across the room, grinning, just using his hands and his arms to pull himself along. Now, he was proud of this sort of thing. Eleanor was aghast that he would do this demonstration in public, and she was so upset she left the room. But for him, that was a source of pride, a source of joy. One of FDR's great political lieutenants was a guy named Jim Farley, who went on to become Postmaster General of the United States. That was the job that political bosses used to get, to become Postmaster General. And they really knew how to run the post office in those days. Farley had been boxing commissioner of the state of New York in the days when boxing was, great. And he once said during the 1932 campaign, there was no greater accolade in the sports writer's lexicon than to say that a guy had been knocked down to the deck, and had gotten up and had come back to win. That was the story that FDR could tell now. He was no longer the Harvard boy born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Now he was this guy who had suffered great adversity. As I say, that became a part of his political identity. As I say too, as I said at the beginning, I'm a writer, not a speaker, so I always try and fit in just a little bit of reading from a book. Let me read to you a short passage that will demonstrate this, I think. This is from the 1928 campaign when Roosevelt was running for governor for the first time. This is the first time that he was really displaying himself out in public in a sustained way, day after day, to hundreds and thousands of people. And he was talking about all the usual things that campaigners, that political candidates talk about. And then finally, this one night in Rochester, New York, before a very large crowd, he began to talk about his disability.
Excuse me, is this going to be lost to the camera? I'd be happy to hold the mic for the reading.
I can do it, I think.
Oh,
You're very kind. Thanks. I hadn't thought of that. For several days, he had been choosing his topics as any other candidate would. He had talked about Al Smith, Albert Ottinger, that's his Republican opponent, the use of the state's rivers for the public good, and so on. Now he said he wished to speak about his plan to do more for the 100,000 New Yorkers who were disabled and unable to pay for the treatments that might help them recover their mobility. I may be pardoned, he said, his smile gone for a moment, if I refer to my own intense interest in the care of crippled children, and indeed of cripples of every kind. At this, people began to rise to their feet and applaud. The reporter from the New York World heard women begin to cry. Roosevelt waited for the noise to subside, then went on. People readily recognize that I myself furnish a perfectly good example of what can be done by the right kind of care. Cheers begin to come again. I dislike to use this personal example, but I do so because it fits. 7 years ago, through an attack of infantile paralysis, I was completely put out of any useful activity. Now, one woman was audibly sobbing. By personal good fortune, I was able to get the best kind of medical care. The result is that today I am on my feet. Now the applause was making it impossible to hear him, and his smile came back, assured, triumphant. I am on my feet, he cried, and entirely capable, at least from the physical point of view, of running any business, whether a private business or that of the government of the state of New York. And I said, with the deftest touch, he was learning to use his disability to his advantage. He must not seem to be asking for votes on the basis of pity. That would be disastrous. But he could instead show himself to be something he had never been seen as before, a fighter, and better yet, an underdog. Not a man to pity, not a man to envy, but a man to cheer. I really came to believe that FDR became president not so much in spite of polio, but because of polio. Near the end of her life, Eleanor was asked, would FDR have become president at all if he had not had polio? And she said she thought, yes, he would have, but president of a different sort. She didn't elaborate, but I think I can. So I'll speak for Eleanor Roosevelt here. He certainly learned a sense of compassion from this experience. Compassion, you know, means to suffer with. FDR, it was in some ways the perfect president to be in office during the Great Depression, because he was able to identify with people who had lost a great deal through no fault of their own. He certainly exemplified courage during his presidency. He had learned to act in spite of one's fear, and he had learned a sense of confidence, hard-won confidence, that he had not had before. He exemplified my favorite aphorism of Eleanor Roosevelt's, who once said, "You must do the thing you think you cannot do." And that certainly is what FDR had done. He had done the thing that no one thought he could do. And that does something for you when you've undergone that kind of experience and had that kind of achievement. We have a story from FDR's cardiologist at the very end of his life. FDR suffered from heart disease, died of a stroke in 1945. And he was cared for by a cardiologist, a young guy named Howard Bruin, who overheard this conversation. FDR was talking with assistants and aides just in a small meeting right near the end of the war. And he said that when the war was over and the United Nations conference had been held, he was thinking that perhaps he would resign from the presidency. He was ready to step down at that point. And one of his assistants said, "Mr. President, you can't do that." And Franklin Roosevelt, who had overcome polio, who had been elected President of the United States 4 times, looks this guy in the face and says, "I do a lot of things I can't do." So I hope you'll have some questions. Thanks for listening. We're doing okay on time, Rob?
We're doing great.
All right.
I have a question.
Sir.
We can pass the mic.
Oh. Thank you. Franklin Roosevelt was notoriously an indifferent student at Harvard. And as you say, he talked all the time. But by World War II, he made brilliant use of his advisors. He ran the round table, table of equals, and he listened. And at what point, perhaps you've seen in your research, because I have no idea, did he learn to listen to people in order to formulate his wisdom?
It's an interesting question about FDR as listener. because he was a great talker and could dominate conversations. But it's clear, first of all, that during the 1920s, when he was going through this period of recovery, he was at home a lot, without a great deal to do at certain times. He read a great deal. He read especially American world history. That's one way that he made up for his rather indifferent educational experience at Harvard. All we know is that when he was governor, when he was president, he relied on information from other people. He informed himself through conversation with other people. During the Depression, he would send people out. One of them was Eleanor, and he would ask her questions about what she had seen and listen carefully to her answers. There were actually trained reporters who acted on his behalf in that way. So what we have is this sort of protean personality who both talked hard and listened hard. I think it's a measurement of FDR's sort of unrecognized intellectual capacity that he could do both of those things. You've put your finger on a little something of a mystery about FDR. A person who turned out to be enormously knowledgeable. He had a huge store of what we used to call general knowledge. And I think that was accumulated, just as you say, through careful listening with those who knew more about subjects than he did, through a certain amount of reading. But we don't. I don't think I fully understand the answer to that. What the answer to that question is. What else?
Go ahead, Roger. You're right by the mic. So.
Yeah, so I watched the the Ken Burns Roosevelt series, and learned a lot about FDR that I hadn't known. I was wondering if there was anything that you learned from watching that, or what might have been in what's in your book that should have been in the series.
Well, I should have been in the series. To tell you the truth, every day for the past 2 weeks I've been asked to say this when I'm asked this question. I only watched like about half an hour of the episode on the 20s, you know, the period that the book covers. And I've had this experience before when watching something on TV about a subject that you know a lot. You may have had this experience yourselves. As a journalist, it always embarrasses me to find out that journalists know less than a lot of people do about their subjects. I just had to turn it off. I just got uncomfortable. I'd seen all the pictures before, and I just didn't want to hear somebody else tell the story. So I'm afraid I can't answer your question. It's sitting there. It's, you know, you can stream all the PBS shows, so it's sitting there waiting for me to watch all of those many hours of television. I'm not sure if I will or not.
To your point, Tolstoy famously said, "History is marvelous if only it were true."
I think there's one over here.
Tolstoy. You know, Tolstoy's been taken apart for his for the history in War and Peace. Some of that's not so good either.
Jim, I was going to ask you, part of the conventional
Mark, you stand up.
Part of the conventional narrative is that the media was complicit in hiding the fact that he was disabled. Is that really true? That they went out of the way not to show, not to let the country know about his disability?
Yeah. Again, the country did know about his disability. What reporters and photographers, well, I'll say especially photographers were asked not to take pictures of Roosevelt when he was walking, or when he was moving from, say, a car to a standing position or back again. Same with trains. Newsreel photographers were asked not to shoot video footage of him in those situations. So that has been spun into this notion that the media, you know, at the behest of FDR's, you know, guards and press agents and so forth. I mean, Marty, you and I both know that reporters don't pay any attention to what press agents, press representatives say. So this is a little bit complicated. But I believe that I know for sure that the reason that they asked for those pictures not to be taken was that FDR did not want to be captured on film falling. And FDR did fall from time to time, in private certainly, a couple of times in public. Now the public can deal with a guy who is lame, quote unquote, right? Which was sort of the general impression of FDR's condition. In some cases, you know, it's sort of true. But imagine public confidence in a guy who is seen time after time falling to the floor, helpless. Just think of the first George Bush when he threw up, you know, in the lap of the Japanese prime minister. If that had happened, you know, several weeks in a row, I think we all would have started to say, you know, what's the deal? Maybe Dan Quayle would be okay as president. So I think FDR was hypersensitive to that possibility and wanted to avoid that at all costs. As for reporters writing about the story, they did write about it in the early days of his comeback, when he was running for governor, and then again when he ran for president in 1932. There were plenty of stories about his physical condition. After that, again, as a journalist, you'll know what I mean when I say it wasn't really a story anymore. The fact that the reporters didn't write about it is an indication of how much people knew about it already. It was not newsworthy anymore. Now, I don't think many people really understood the extent of his disability. And people would have been surprised to know that inside the White House in private, he was moved about in a wheelchair, which was 10 times faster and 10 times easier than getting around on his braces. He hated these braces, which were terribly uncomfortable. And you didn't use them when you were sitting down anyway, unless it was just for a couple of minutes. When people sort of, by happenstance, saw FDR being moved, being carried by assistants, by Secret Service, they were shocked. We have several reports of people who saw this and they said, oh my God, I didn't know he was, you know, that crippled. We didn't know he was that disabled. So, as I say, the extent would have been surprising to people, but the fact of his disability was very well known.
So, this has been very interesting for a lot of us, and Larry and I were just talking about loops and you know, things we've developed in old age. I've got one from an early childhood illness that I had that's acting up, and I've talked to several other people here who are dealing with this. I think this hits home for a lot of people at a different level than maybe I anticipated. One of the things that we do here, the connect part, we ask people at the tables to talk a little bit about what they've heard, and then maybe come up with a question or a comment, something that they want to give back to you. So if we could take about 5 minutes and you guys at your tables or in groups of 3 or 4 and just discuss what Jim has said, and then see if you could come up with another question or if you have a comment to maybe add to what he's learned so far from your personal reactions.
You know, I always thought the relationship between
It doesn't kill you, makes you stronger. Did you watch the series?
I watched
Any comments? Where do you want to start? Connie or Deb? Okay, come on up and you want. Can you hear okay without the mic, Roger?
Yeah.
Okay, Deb, stand up and please.
We have a question about.
There you go. I didn't want you behind the post.
We have a question about Eleanor. You haven't really talked about her, and we know that she was a very strong and powerful person in her own right. And I guess we've always seen her as sort of like the woman behind the man. So, can you comment on her role in his presidency and in his return to power or rise to power?
Well, I'll say a couple of things about that. One thing is that as somebody who reads a lot of history and biography, I've come to think that Eleanor Roosevelt has actually sort of surpassed FDR in our current day sort of public esteem. And maybe she deserves that. She was not, however, President of the United States during the two worst crises of the 20th century. So I tried to bring the focus back to FDR as an interesting profile. That is not to denigrate Eleanor Roosevelt in the slightest. She's one of my heroes and certainly one of the great figures in American history. She played a very important role during FDR's presidency as a political power in her own right, and then especially as someone who, what should I say? She was. People have said that Eleanor acted as FDR's legs. I think in some ways she acted as his heart. The sense of compassion that she projected, both during the Depression and then during the war, was extraordinary. It gave a public face to FDR's presidency that expanded their influence together. As for polio, she played a critical role early on. She had been betrayed by FDR in their marriage just 3 years before he became sick. You all know the story of his affair with Lucy Mercer during World War I, which Eleanor discovered, and they were estranged, though still married. Polio, for a time, I think, brought them back together. This was a new crisis that they very much went through together. Eleanor had training as a nurse, and she literally nursed him for 6 or 8 months. She was the primary caregiver to FDR, 1921, 1922. Then as he began to pursue treatment, largely in other locations, partly because he was seeking these sort of therapeutic environments, especially Warm Springs, the mineral pools at Warm Springs, Georgia, he was gone a lot. And it was clear that recovering from disability was going to be his first priority. I think that freed Eleanor to pursue the career that she had just begun on her own before he became ill, as a politician, as a teacher, as a writer. I think she had started on that trajectory, was pulled back to him by the disease and that crisis of the disease, and then he went his way, she went her way, and there was an understanding between them that they would pursue these parallel tracks. They would help each other, which they certainly did. He helped her, she helped him. They would deal with the question of, the questions that arose over their children. They shared a life, but it was also a life that proceeded on 2 tracks. So polio did, I think, play an important role in the relationship that developed later on.
Table here, have a question? Yeah. Okay, Eric?
Yeah, we actually had a lot of questions come up from the table, but we wanted to take the spotlight off FDR and back to you and find out a little more about what you're working on next and what you've got on the job.
Thanks. The first thing I'm doing is just starting to work on a book about the same topic for young readers. Okay, I've written a couple of picture books actually. I'm very interested in writing for children. This is my first attempt to write for, well, we'll see whether it's upper elementary or the so-called young adult group. We haven't worked that out with my publisher yet. That's that's what I'm working on the same topic. As for the next thing, I have a couple of ideas, but I haven't decided yet. This was my own long ordeal with polio, and it took longer than it should have. So I've got to kind of recover from this project before I know what the next big one is going to be. Yes, ma'am.
Being a voice image specialist, I wanted to know if you considered how he used his voice to show strength.
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, she asked about using his voice. There's a whole book that's been written about FDR's rhetoric and how it was affected by his disability. That's about the words he chose more than about his delivery. But there's no question that although he was already a skilled orator, he became a greater orator when he was president. And he was a master, of course, of this brand new medium at the time, radio, and the intimacy that he established. And think about that for a minute. You all know about the influence of the fireside chats during his presidency.
Young people may not.
Young people may not. Yeah, we're young people, aren't we? So FDR would. It wasn't as often as people now think, but every couple months, sometimes less often, he would sit down with radio microphones and be recorded. Well, no, it was broadcast live. He would explain problems of current affairs to a national audience, but in a very casual way, very conversational way, not a speech. And this increased his popularity, expanded his following, and it really established this sense that there was a person who understood the people's personal problems. This had never happened before between the president and the public. Think of that. Here's this voice, disembodied voice, not a visible figure, okay? It's just the voice. And it was the voice of a confident, strong man. He had a lovely speaking voice. And he had this, combination of this accent that was a combination of the Hudson River Valley, New York aristocracy, Boston Brahmin. Nobody sounded better than Franklin Roosevelt when he spoke. And so that too was a way of creating in people's minds an image of this man that had nothing to do with the fact that his legs were atrophied and couldn't hold him up. So, yeah, perhaps and I probably should have made more of this. If I'd extended the book all the way through the presidency, I would have. But I should have made more of the fact that simply by the way he spoke, by the way his voice sounded, he conveyed a sense of strength to people. No question.
So 80 years later, now that we are so enlightened about disabilities and there's the ADA laws and all, are we better prepared as a society to elect a disabled person as president, or is it now even more important that a candidate appear 100% flawless?
Yeah. That's a good question too. I've heard many people sort of ask that question with the assumption that you did not convey, with the assumption that, oh, the media would never let that happen today. They'd be poking and prying and they'd find out how disabled he was. I think that a candidate with this degree of disability would pursue a much different strategy in letting people know the extent of his disability. But I actually believe that Americans are capable of electing a person who has that sort of disability. Now, we can be very smug about that, but imagine the many other kinds of disabilities that we probably would not tolerate. For instance, I was thinking, forgive me if this seems extreme, but I was thinking about something that would not be, that would throw most people off today. What if a presidential candidate had an extreme facial deformity? Nothing else is affected about his or her capabilities. Able-bodied otherwise, absolutely of sound mind, brilliant perhaps. Do we elect somebody who has a severe facial deformity? My guess is no, because that person would never be allowed, given the mores of our culture, to rise to that kind of prominence, to be able to run for high office. We just don't, you know, like that's like, oh my God, I never thought of that, but we would never elect someone like that. This person would have to speak for us to foreign countries, represent us. And you know, that's what people thought about Roosevelt. He's crippled. How can he be president? So we must guard against the temptation to think that we have shed all sense of stigma. We have not.
I would say that I think the people might vote for him, but for him to get to that nomination might be impossible because the parties would think that it would be too impossible for their party to be elected by somebody that's crippled.
Well, you know, I would say that it's happened now at several levels just below the presidency. Max Cleland, double amputee, veteran of Vietnam, was elected to the Senate from Georgia. The current candidate for nominee for governor in Texas is a person in a wheelchair. Now, I don't agree with you. I think we're ready to go when it comes to a number of sorts of physical disability. Bob Dole had a significant physical disability. He was severely wounded in World War II and never had the full use of one of his arms. So I think that we have made some progress on a certain level.
Okay, we're gonna want to leave some time for
signing. I have one other question. This is a leadership group. I know you've written about leaders, and everybody, I think you've written a lot about courage too, especially with Ernie Pyle and the Wright brothers, people who have gone up against great odds, and a couple of your quotes are great. I wonder if you have any major thoughts about, well, what is it about a person that makes them a leader, makes them somebody who's willing to take these risks? What insights do you have about that? Big question.
Yeah, the honest answer is, Rob, I don't know anything about leadership. I haven't learned anything about leadership. I'll tell you, I mean, FDR, a president, the quintessential kind of leader, certainly an absolutely undying faith in oneself is characteristic of FDR. This enormous drive that I don't think we can quite explain. I certainly can't explain it. The drive that allowed him to overcome polio. He had a very powerful mother whom he was close to. He was an only child. I think she raised the bar of expectation for him very high. She didn't want him to go into politics, but she did expect him to be a certain kind of man. That certainly increased his sense of drive. But, geez, everybody in this room has some version of that. What makes a Roosevelt, a Churchill, an Eleanor Roosevelt? I'm not sure. The person who comes to mind when you ask about that is not a conventional leader, the person I've written about, but did lead in the field of technology and invention. That's Wilbur Wright. This book I wrote about the Wright brothers really emphasized Wilbur's role as the founder and leader of their project. And with him, with both of those brothers, but with Wilbur Wright especially, I was struck by how he pursued the thing that he cared about so deeply, which was the joy of scientific experiment. Without seeking, without doing so for the purpose of the achievement itself, but because of the joy he took in the work. So joy, I think, the cliche is we follow our passion. There is something to it. I'm just so sick of hearing that phrase, but it expresses what I'm talking about here. I think that Ernie Pyle was no leader. He was a great writer, not a leader. But boy, Wilbur Wright, showed the world a new way to do this extraordinary thing that people had dreamed about for centuries, simply by immersing himself in his own particular passion and pursuing that wherever it went.
Thank you. I want to share with you, we also talk a lot about collaboration in here, and I preach it to my students, but Jim and I had the pleasure for many years of participating in a writers group, which consisted of us and then John Bacon, has spoken here and has been prominent in the news recently, Randy Milgram, who has been working on a novel for as long as you've been working on your biography of FDR, I think, Rick Ratliff, your colleague Dick Campbell, and it was an extraordinary, probably decade that we worked together. I published a book, you published a couple things. I mean, it was just amazing to get together once a month or so and share our ideas and our manuscripts, and I was able to hear Jim kind of develop his ideas. So when you talk about what's new, and you think about following your passion, how about following it for 10 years in a dusty room with a bunch of boxes? I mean, that's what historians have to do. So you got to be pretty darn passionate about it. Same thing, I think, with any kind of thing you do, where it's research, with students do a paper. I mean, it's hard work. It takes a lot of discipline. So I applaud you for all you've done for us and for everybody else. And let's give Jim a great hand. Thank you very much. It's great to see. He's come a long way since 20, I'll tell you. So we're going to have Hillary orchestrate the signing here. And I know some of you will be willing to wait and have Jim sign the book for you. Others, if you cannot have Jim sign it, maybe you can just leave a card or something that you want it signed, and maybe they can send you a check or whatever, or you could process the card. Because I know some of you want the book but have to go. By the way, I would say Christmas is coming, Hanukkah's coming, so this is a great gift for people, if I can make that pitch. And actually, if you want to buy any gift, go to Literati. There's no book more appreciated than a good book, except one that you don't get through. That's a harder one. I've been trying Anna Karenina for about 3 months now, but I'll keep going. Keep going. It gets better. Okay. At page 700, it starts with speed. So Jim, you want to come over here, and please feel free to hang out. Don't leave any food. If you, all this food will go to waste, so please take some back to your workplace, your home.
I'll be in touch.
So Jim will be over here for the signing. You can buy the books over there.
Where do you meet?
We meet at the Michigan Union in the Anderson.
And you said it's like 1 to 1, 12:30 to 1:30?
12:30, yeah, the lunch is basically from 1 to 12.
You would not be self-effacing about what you do, and I thought you were the perfect person to ask.